Matt. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to greet you today. I trust me, I can vouch. It's very difficult for Matt to talk about school, going back to school, isn't it, Mrs. Smith? I remember my buoyant teenage childhood friend who was like, he was like a young preacher when he was 15. He was like a little televangelist going around. And I'd see him happy until about August 3rd, August 4th, and then it would tank. My tanking comes after Christmas. Matt's tanking comes then. So that took a lot of courage for him to talk about school. And look, we haven't been in school for years, but it's PTSD. So we relate. We relate to all the younger people here. We really do. And let me greet those of you that are watching at home. I just got a text from somebody watching at home. Took a picture of the screen, says, Greg, I prove it, I'm watching. So I'm going to make sure that they're doing that the whole time. I'm going to keep my phone out, make sure that they're staying in. No. But I love that we're able to do this in the summer with people traveling, and every week, we've got kind of a, crazy schedule, and it's just good to see, about a half of the church as we go through the summer, and it always makes me eager to get back to the fall and just see everybody as they get back in their rhythm. So I hope you're doing well, hope your traveling is going well. I got a few people I could do this with. Normally, my man Scott that sits up here, my fellow friend, Orioles friend, I could do this with. He's not here. I got Jason Jack. I don't know if Jason's here today, but I see my man Dave Wilson. Dave, I'm going to start with you. Give me a prescription or two that could fix the Orioles' recent woes. Please. What's that? Take more pitches. So they need to stop pressing at the plate, right? What about fielding? Yes. Fundamentals. Gunnar is the commander of the infield, right? So when he is calling Urias off, Urias should step back, correct? And there's some pitching changes we need. We talk about this stuff all the time, right? If you're an Orioles fan right now, these are the dog days of summer. The only good news, because I do believe God shows up in baseball, is that the Yankees are losing too, which is good. Vito, where are you, brother? That's for you. They did win last night. That's good. And we did not. So they gained another game and stuff. But yeah, this is the time where the sports fans start thinking about what do we do to tinker? What do we do to fix? What do you do to fix something, right? And it's just human nature. People get upset. It's the political season. So what is this person going to do? What is that candidate going to do? It's do. This is how we change, right? This is what we do to change. So it is natural to think, what is it that we do to change when we consider becoming more fully devoted in our faith, following Jesus with more intensity? That's what we're going to talk about today in this last message. Oh, and I did forget one more important announcement. He's an introvert, so he's probably going to be mad that I interrupted this. But our awesome drummer, he does many more things than drum, Dan Gurdon, I'm told it's his birthday today. So Dan, where are you? Where is he? He's back there. Dan, I'd like you to come up here and just share 5, 6 personal things about yourself. Just a couple real personal things, fears, hopes. Emily will come up and do that for him. Have no hesitation to do it, but I'm not going to do that. But I had to say that about Dan because Dan and Emily do so much for us and serving our church so much. And just very quick, get a chance. Dan's quiet, unassuming way. He'll appreciate it if you tell him happy birthday, I'm sure. But we are going to kind of look at where I left off last week in terms of how we change. And this is what we covered last week, Romans 7:6. But now we are released from the law. And that's what we talked about last week. If you're a follower of Jesus, we should not be defining ourselves as those who kind of live under the law, which always invites what? Do more, try harder. That's the recipe of law keeping. Do more, try harder. Improve. But what we've seen in the series, and it's hard not to preach it with the same intensity every time, is we can't keep it. The law's purpose was never to be a ladder to get us to heaven, but a mirror to show us our need that we can't get there on our own, right? I heard somebody say years ago that, what do you see in the morning you see a mirror in the bathroom, and it tells us bad things about ourselves, right? It shows us things about ourselves that aren't pleasant, right? We look and we see the crust in those of you that have hair, I used to remember that. It's all tufted and it's a mess, right? But you don't then take the mirror and brush your teeth with it. You don't take the mirror and comb your hair with it, right? That's not the mirror's job. The mirror's job is to show you there is a problem, and the law of God that reflects his holy and perfect character shows us there's a problem. He's holy. We're sinful. The Grand Canyon chasm between us cannot be bridged by human effort. So we should not be surprised that Paul, who's writing this verse to a young church in the city of Rome, says we're released from the law. We don't live by the law. That's not what we do. We're not law people. Having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve, and notice serve is a language of dynamic activity, right? It was used of the priests in the Old Testament who would serve and make sure day and night that the ministry of worship in the nation of Israel was covered. How do we serve? In the new way. I love that. The new way of the Spirit, not in the old way of the written code. So you say, that sounds great, Greg. And I've been accused of this my whole adult preaching life, and it's a fair criticism. Greg, I got the why. I'm not hearing a whole lot of how, which is why I'm so thankful for Matt. And I mean this. Matt helps me on a personal level. Matt is so gifted at the how. I talk to him regularly. Matt, how? And he just shares his wisdom, what he's learned in life, what he's learned of Scripture. And I love that we benefit from that. So pray for me, because this is a little more on the how. But you know me, I'm probably going to lean a little more to the why. But pray that the Spirit will make up the difference. So here's a question, and it's a how question. How do we experience spiritual growth if we're not trying to live by the law? How? Because I just said it with my little Orioles question to Dave, right? Some of you were thinking. You could ask about anything. How do you fix public education? How do you fix the post office, right? How do you fix the weeds that you can't seem to get rid of in your front lawn? How? And every answer, every prescription is just that. It's a prescription to do. It requires activity. So we are conditioned to think, how? What? So it's not the law, but see, the law was good because it gave me do this, not this. You know that, isn't that like a diet trend, this, not that? We love that kind of stuff, right? People tell us, don't do this, do this. I don't have to think, I just get to do. But Greg, if you take away the law, I lose all that. And you're right, we do. But when this same author, Paul, who wrote this letter to the fledgling church at Rome, wrote a letter to the young church in the city of Corinth. This verse captivated me about 30 years ago, and I think 30 years proves it wasn't a fad. If you want to find a place where Paul boils down the reason why we change, how we can grow, how we can become, as C.S. Lewis once said, a little bit less and less like ourselves, and a little bit more and more like Jesus. It isn't by law keeping. And he gives us the answer in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. I left there last week. Paul says, and we all with unveiled face. Don't worry about that if you think, what does that mean? We'll talk about that in a moment. Beholding the glory of the Lord, who in this context is the Lord Jesus, if you read 2 Corinthians 3, are being, do you see the change language? Transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. When Paul boils down how we change, it's not about beholding. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. It's not about behaving. It's not really ultimately even about believing, although that I think is implied. It's about beholding. We, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being what? Transformed. I am convinced, and I've been testing this for 3 decades now, that the only real, substantive, appreciable, spiritual progress I have ever made is in keeping, not with good habits and good discipline, that stick for a while and then fall away, but to the degree that I am captivated with Jesus Christ, to the degree that I am beholding Jesus Christ, to the degree that I am enthralled with Jesus Christ. That is the same degree to which I experience genuine spiritual change. So, what about all this talk about the veiled face, etc.? Where's that coming from? Because this would work for me. This is how I look at it. This would work for me, but I don't get the whole veil or unveiled thing on the face. What's going on here? He is alluding to a famous story in Israel's history. And we don't have to recap that whole story. We can just kind of parachute right into the crux of the moment. And it's about probably the most famous person in the Old Testament story, Moses, who was tasked. He had a speech impediment, right? We learned that he struggled with cowardice, but God chose him to be the vessel to lead his people out of bondage in Egypt, across the Red Sea into a land of promise. And the first 5 books of the Bible are all about that journey. And Moses at one point seemed so intent on, Lord, I can't do this unless I really see who you are. And in Exodus chapter 33, verse 18, we have one of the most profound prayers. And I wonder if you've ever prayed this prayer. Lord, he says, I pray you, show me your glory. Glory? What's that? If I ask you to define glory, can you give me a quick definition? I can't. It's similar if I were to ask you to define the word beauty. Can you give me a quick definition? I can't either. Beauty and glory, I think, are better beheld than they are defined. You sort of know it when you see it, but don't dare ask me to define it. But we'll take a shot at it. We do get a little hint in what God says in response to Moses' request. Lord, show me your glory. And you might think, well, what exactly does that mean? And God answers in the next verse and said, I myself will make all my goodness, it's interesting, pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And notice, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show compassion on whom I show compassion. It's interesting that when Moses requests to see what we might understand something like God's essence, God responds, I'm going to show you my goodness, my compassion, and my grace. I love that. I love telling people that are far from God, if I have the privilege of introducing, for the very first time in some cases, who the God of the Bible is, and to dispel the notion of kind of tribal, territorial, explosive, eruptive anger and some of these caricatures that have set in very deep, at least in the American psyche, and to be able to say that he is good, and he's gracious, and he's merciful. And I know that because when Moses asked to see his glory, those are the first words God uses to define himself. And then I don't have time to show the rest of the narrative. It's interesting. God says to Moses, Moses, this is too intense for you. It's too intense for me and all of us. So it's interesting. He kind of places him, the old parlance is the cleft of a rock. Imagine these kind of outcropping rocks, and there's a little place that you could kind of get yourself in where your vision is, obscured. And God says, and I will pass by. And he says, you will actually see, the term is something like the afterburn when I go by. That alone will almost kill you. So there's something really transcendent, really eternal, essential happening in this passage. So I would simply say, this is my best attempt at definition. It's not great. I submit it to you. You can probably come up with a better one, but here's mine. I've been using this for about 30 years. God's glory is the outshining of all of his attributes. It's about the best I can do, and it's not even close to what it must be. But it's the outshining. It's something that's manifested of who he is. Now, here's what's interesting. I believe with all my heart, the more people I talk to, Christians or non-Christians, this is the longing of every human heart. This is what we were made for. We were made to see it. We were made to behold him. This is what we long for. So every good relationship is probably good because it's some poor, diluted, diminished, outer concentric circle echo of the heart of what we really long for. Every broken relationship, every pain is some inversion of that glorious center, some perversion, as it were, that this isn't the way it's supposed to be. I talked to somebody recently who told me that they had a meeting where they were talked down to and belittled and ridiculed, and it's really messed with them. And I tried to help that person see, I've been in those meetings. I've probably been on the giving and the receiving end of those meetings. Takeaway probably. We're not meant to hear that kind of communication. That's why it's so harmful. Because we're not designed for it. This is a product of a broken and fallen world. We're designed to behold beauty that is indescribable. Many years ago, the author John Piper used this analogy. I've never really found a better one. He wrote, "We are all starved for the glory of God, not self." No one goes to the Grand Canyon to increase self-esteem. Why do we go? Because there is greater healing for the soul in beholding splendor than there is in beholding self. Somebody tell me after church. Again, you know, my mind's always going to movies. Kevin Kline and Danny Glover. There's a movie where Glover makes this line. I think he tells Kline, "Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon?" And he said, "No." And he says, "You should go." I said, "Why?" "Because you will feel like the mosquito on the butt of the horse that parades by you that you never think of. That's how small you will feel." And there's a little bit of that there, isn't there? Nobody stands at the Grand Canyon and holds out a mirror and says, "I am awesome." Like, you don't do that at the Grand Canyon, right? Lisa and I went to Niagara Falls back in '97 when I graduated seminary. My parents gave us a gift, and they said, "We want to send you to Niagara Falls." We're like, "Great, we have no money. You can send us to Glen Burnie. And I'll spend all weekend at the Honeybee." So anyway, I digress. I shouldn't have mentioned that, because now that's all my mind is on. But here we are, and Lisa remembers this is pre-internet, really. So remember, Lisa, we had the old Fodor's travel guide? And you remember I'm looking up all the restaurants? Remember the one you could eat the 70-ounce steak? I can rise to such occasions. So here we are, and she said, "Oh, great." And I said, "Yeah, the falls will be nice." I said, "Who cares?" Yeah, I just wanted to kind of check out some of the cool stuff there. And we still by that fall. Have you ever been there? Just every day, you can't take your eyes off it, right? Because it's breathtaking. You just think, man, God made that. I think it was the Puritan John Trapp who once said, "God made the country and man made the town, and you can tell the difference," right? There's something about God's glory. It's what we long for. And here's the great part of the story of God. God gives it a full measure to his people. So the book of Exodus is a tough book because it's exciting until about chapter 15. And if you read the book of Exodus, once you get past chapter 15, they're out of the Red Sea, they're in the promised land or close to it. They're actually in the wilderness, traveling towards the promised land, I should say. And you're waiting to see what's going to happen next. And then it's about 20 chapters of architecture for the tabernacle. And that's when most people quit on their yearly Bible reading plan, sometime late January. But the end of the story is really the zenith of the book of Exodus. Let me show you what happens at the end. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and here it is, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Oh. This little primitive tent, it's just really a prototype of a later temple, but that's centuries away under Solomon. And then they've got this incredible ending. I mean, the glory of God, it's kind of manifested in a cloud form, just filling the tabernacle. And then you see the last verse of the book of Exodus, "For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys." Now let's step back and ask the question then, when is the last time we see the glory of God in the Old Testament story? You ever wondered that? I'll tell you, it's embarrassing to be a seminary graduate, be at your first church, my senior pastor, Dave Shive, who's going to be here in November, by the way, doing a marriage seminar. You heard it here first. Very excited. Tremendous mentor. He asked me this question. Greg, when's the last time you see the glory of God in the Old Testament? Book of Hesitations? I don't know. I couldn't come up with the answer. He was gentle with me. It's actually in the book of Ezekiel. Don't show that slide yet, Kwame, because I want to just set a little bit of background for it really quick. Ezekiel is a prophet God chooses who has to see some really difficult stuff. At that time in history, Israel's going to get rocked, and Jeremiah has to see it. Babylonians are going to do their damage. It's a really ugly time because Israel has just been sinning and sinning and sinning for centuries. And Ezekiel, starting in chapter 10, it's kind of told in sequences. That's why I can't show it to you in one verse. The glory of the Lord starts moving out of the temple. I mean, if you think out of the Holy of Holies, across the temple floor, out through the outer courts, out through the gates, across the Kidron Valley, over the eastern mountains, probably Mount of Olives. And in Ezekiel 11:23, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that's on the east side of the city. That's the last time in the Old Testament narrative we see this glory of God, this manifestation of his beauty and goodness and power. And it is a devastating dagger in the heart of Ezekiel and the people. Why? Because their sin has become so noxious that God manifests his displeasure and the glory of the Lord goes. And Dave Shive set me up for this because he said, when's the next time you think, Greg, we see the glory of God? And by the grace of God, I knew this one. So let's ask that question. When is the next time we see the glory of God in the story of the Bible? When? It's John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, this is a term means logos. It's a term from Greek philosophy, which the Greek ancients would have understood, much like people understand George Lucas as the Force. It's kind of the essential stuff of the universe. In Marvel parlance, it's all the stuff that would be in Thanos' stones, right? It's just the essence of the universe. But John turns it on its head and says, I'll take you at your logos, but I'm going to tell you something you didn't know about him. He's a person. He's a person that stands in a special relationship with God. Oh, more than that, he actually is God. What? He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. That would have blown their circuits. But that's just the setup for the truth bomb of verse 14, which we don't typically see until Christmas, but let's look at it in July. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and there it is. We have seen his glory. Glory is the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Remember that glory we saw in Ezekiel? Out the temple, across the courts, through the valley, over the mountains. Little baby, born in Bethlehem. God became man, and we beheld his glory. Because let me tell you, my favorite discovery about 25, 30 years ago is to learn that Jesus is the glory of God. Let's kind of look at that as we see. I'll give you 3 verses of many. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8. None of the rulers of this age understood it. Understood what? Who Jesus was. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of what? Glory. Ooh. Well, let's look at we can all do this with the Corinthian correspondence. 2 Corinthians 4:4. The God of this age, small g, it's a reference to the devil, has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So again, I love teaching my children this. We've done it for years. I said, the Hollywood Satan that you see, scary, deep voice, get out, all that stuff, is ridiculous. He doesn't really care about scaring people. That just makes big money that fills movie theaters. His goal is far more sinister, far more persistent. He's at it 24/7. It's to keep people from seeing what? The thing for which they were created, the glory of God. Where's that found? Jesus. That's what he works tirelessly to do. So what is the story of you or me who now see Jesus as supremely glorious? How did that happen? 2 verses later. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness. Now that's the language from creation. Made his light shine in our hearts. That's the language of recreation, new creation. To give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. Where's it found? In the face of Christ. So, let me go back to our opening verse, 2 Corinthians 3:18. And we all, with unveiled face, do you see it now? Beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. The part I didn't tell you yet is that when Moses saw the glory of the Lord, that little after effect, that obscure view in the rocks, it changed his countenance. It radiated light. And do you know what happened? The light, the reflected light of the afterburn of Yahweh was so intense that the people couldn't stare Moses in the face, and Moses had to wear a veil over his face to keep the people from freaking, quite frankly. Notice what Paul is saying. We with unveiled face, because of what Jesus Christ has done, because he loved you eternally with just fierce affection and went to the cross for you and me and gave up his life for you and me. He removes all barriers. That Grand Canyon chasm between us is now closed. We can walk directly into the presence of God because of what Jesus done with unveiled face. And we get to look at Jesus and apparently get transformed in the process. So here's what I've learned in my life that I share with you. The more we behold Christ, the more we change. Now, I want to be careful here. There's a lot of great stuff on spiritual disciplines. Maybe I'm uniquely able to speak to this or shouldn't speak to this, but I'll try speaking to it. It's going to shock you. I'm not the most disciplined guy in the world. I go on good streaks. I've done my Bible yearling reading plan. In 38 years, I've done it fully twice. And I've made a lot of stops and starts, right? I've had some good times of prayer. One of my spiritual mentors who passed on in 2012 only had to sleep about 3 hours a night. He was a uniquely gifted man, and his wife, now widow, confirmed to me after his death. I said, how much did he pray? It was about 4 hours a day. I've never prayed 4 hours a day. Never once in my life. I'm just telling you the truth. I've never prayed 4 hours a day. Not once. But when I've seen Jesus held out to me clearly in the gospel, and my heart, by his grace, rises to meet him and says, I want him. Those are the moments, usually, where my pride gets broken down, and I apologize to my family for being a jerk, right? When Christ is held out clearly to me, those are the times that a grudge that I was holding and sometimes cherishing kind of start to evaporate. And I can go, because there's something about beholding Jesus that brings change. That's what it's always about. The message of the gospel is not do more, try harder. It's look at Christ. This is what it means to be people who don't live under the law, but live under the gospel of the grace of God, empowered by the Spirit of God. We see him. And I'm going to give you one more story that many of you know, and I can't think of a more perfect illustration. And it's about two women, and I bet you can guess their names. Give you a hint. They both start with M. Let's look at Luke 10. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. She loved Jesus. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. I would say Mary's posture in this whole story is what? Beholding Jesus. That's really all she wants. Now, Martha's not a villain in the story. Martha's going to work her fingers to the bone because that's who she is. Martha's like a guy I know over here who bounces when he plays the keyboard. I don't know a guy that works harder than that. Really don't. So I think of this. Martha, I want to be very clear, is not the bad character in this story. She's a good character in the story. So is Mary. They're meant for us to see something that we all fall into. Next verse. But Martha was distracted with much serving. She went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Isn't it interesting that, do you not care? It's always an interesting question of Jesus. And of course, he's incensed. No, he's not incensed. Martha was going to make sure there wasn't a dust bunny anywhere in sight when Jesus was in her house, right? Red carpet treatment, I mean, it's commendable devotion. What Jesus is saying, he's not discouraging her for working at all. He never does. He's highlighting Mary and what she's doing. She says, Lord, tell her to help me. Well, how does Jesus respond? The Lord answered her. A lot of people have done this. It takes you back to the Brady Bunch, right? Martha, Martha, Martha. Just have to make that Marcia. You are anxious and troubled about many things, but I love this. One thing is necessary. What is it? Well, he tells us. It's what Mary has chosen. Mary has chosen the good portion, and I love this. Jesus says, Mary, I'm not taking that from her. Don't worry about the work. Don't worry about the output. Jesus takes care of all of that. You know the people that are going to put out the most output, the most work. This is where I bring Matt back into the story. It's a person like Matt who's enthralled with Jesus Christ. And it produces change. It looks different for every person because we're not little automatons. Right? We're not like the old song in the 60s, A Kingdom of Ticky-Tack, where everybody's the exact same and does the exact same and looks the exact same and does the exact same. We're all wired differently. We have different personalities. We're gifted differently. But the genuine change takes place when you are captivated with Jesus, right? That's the genuine change. Mary, captivated with Jesus, and Jesus, no, Martha. I'm not taking that away. Mary's getting a taste of what she was created for, just like you were, just like every person in this room, just like every person on this planet. This is why we're here, that we might, by his grace, have the veil lifted, see with an unveiled face. That's Jesus. He is the manifestation. He's the true outshining of all that God is. Remember when Jesus told Philip in John 14? Philip says, Jesus, show us the Father. And what does Jesus say? You're looking at him. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Takeaway thought for our series as well as our message. We'll start something new next week. When we are captivated by the glory and beauty of Jesus, we experience genuine spiritual change. Lord, thank you for speaking to us so clearly in your word. Would you keep Jesus before us? Would we long to hear his story? Would what we have out in the lobby, which is a great sign, be just as true and increasing measure in our hearts? You, Jesus, are our lead story. There's so many things that compete for my attention, Lord. I could turn on the news and get lost. I could look at the internet and get lost. Lord, I could get in conversation about trivial things and get lost. But you, Lord, are our lead story. Would you help us as a congregation behold Jesus and be changed by beholding him? In his name we pray. Amen.